Right, so AO2 now, and ethics can only ever respond to science. So this is one area of questions which you could get for your AO2 essay in the exam. So remember, what we're looking for is 3 arguments for, 3 arguments against, with a nice clear line of argument using sentence starters at the beginning of your paragraph, like most people would agree, or some people would say, or a very strong argument is, or very weak argument is, and so on. And we want 3 arguments for, against, and the arguments for and against should link. You should have an argument, then a counter-argument, then a counter-argument, and so on, until you reach a valid and logical conclusion at the end. So the first argument in favour of the statement that ethics can only ever respond to science is the fact that we cannot predict the future, and science and technology develops so quickly that it's just not possible to know what's going to happen in the future. And so quite often those very rapid developments in science and technology have unforeseen consequences. They have consequences that we just could not have predicted. So for example, social networking, that the advancement in that technology has led to the unforeseen consequences of discrimination, nasty comments, trolling being done on social networking sites, which has led to people going to court and so on. Now, ethics could not have put rules in place before the invention of social networking, because it was just unforeseen that it would be used for those kinds of things, and so it was just not predictable, and so therefore ethics could not have done anything about it, and so therefore it can only ever respond to developments like this, where they move so quickly and they have unforeseen uses, unforeseen consequences. It can only ever respond to developments like those. However, as a counter-argument, ethics should not have to respond to science and developments in technology, because scientists should think ethically in the first place. If scientists are trained in ethics, then they would know what the possible ethical consequences of their scientific discoveries would be, and if they know that it's going to have bad consequences, immoral consequences, then they wouldn't do that thing in the first place. So for example, medical researchers using animals in their experiments are trained. They actually have to do ethical training. They have to do a course on the ethical use of animals in experimentation, and so therefore they wouldn't do something that was going to be immoral in the first place. And so therefore ethics does not just respond to science, it actually preempts possible unethical science by making sure that scientists are trained in ethics in the first place. Second argument for, ethics should only respond to science, otherwise it could end up preventing discovery. And so if ethics has too much control over science and scientific developments and whatever, then it could end up actually preventing the discovery of something very useful. So for example, we saw with stem cell research that ethics prevents its use and prevents research into stem cell research, but actually that research could save lives, and so there could be an argument that it should only ever really respond to scientific development, because otherwise it's going to prevent discovery. So it should really only ever come up with guidelines after those things have been discovered. However, we could say, as a counter-argument to that whilst it could prevent discovery, it's better to prevent discovery than to ending up going down a slippery slope. And remember, the slippery slope is this idea that, more and more ethically dubious things are allowed. So if you allow one thing to happen, who's to say that 3-4 years down the line something else is going to be allowed which we previously thought was immoral, and then if you go 3 or 4 years down the line further, something even worse could be allowed until it gets out of hand. And so for example, with cloning, there needs to be guidance in place to prevent the creation of a superhuman race, even if this means that there's going to be less discovery. So our third argument for the statement that it can only ever respond to science is the idea that ethical guidelines just go out of date really quickly. So even if there are guidelines in place, they go out of date so quickly, and so ethics really can only ever respond to science, because by the time you've established some guidelines, they've already become obsolete, they've already become kind of not very useful, because technology has moved on so quickly that whilst you were deciding what was right and what was wrong, it's already moved on, and we don't need those guidelines anymore. So, for example, computer technology advances so quickly that guidelines quickly just become, obsolete and not useful anymore, because the technology's moved on. So, things to do with apps and how they're used and things, if you put ethical guidelines in place for them, a year down the line, those same apps won't be really used anymore, and so those guidelines, there was no point in having those guidelines in the first place. Or, texting and so on, all those kinds of things, they develop so quickly that you have some ethical guidelines on texting, for example, and then a year down the line, we're not using texting anymore, we're using picture messaging, or we're using FaceTime or something like that, and so those ethical guidelines have just become obsolete. They've become not really very useful anymore because we've moved on. And so therefore, ethics can really only ever respond to science, because even if ethical guidelines are put in place, they quickly become out of date. So finally then, our third counter-argument to that then is that it's better to have rules which will go out of date than no rules at all. And it's a similar argument to the slippery slope idea, but what you need to do to differentiate them is link it into how in society we have rules which change all the time, but it doesn't mean we don't have any rules, we just change the rules. And so it's the same with ethics. There's nothing wrong with changing rules, adapting rules. And so, no, it shouldn't just respond to to science. It should have rules in place in the first place, and then when they need changing, they get changed. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and put those rules in place in the first place. So remember, when you're writing your conclusion, whatever you decide to conclude on this question, please start your conclusion with the evidence would suggest that we should agree or disagree to some extent or completely or whatever you want to say. Don't say I agree, because it's not particularly academic. Make sure you're saying the evidence would suggest. And remember, all the way through your essay you should have had a clear line of argument using sentence starters in your paragraphs, like most people would agree, some people would agree, and so on. And your conclusion should be valid and logical based on that line of argument.